Hello. Another day, another chapter. Can't remember if I mentioned it before, but I've realized that the light that I take photos of the drawings of Mowat in the book off my Kindle greatly affects the way they look. If I take them under the light of the LED light bulbs that I have in the house, which have a yellowish tint, the drawings end up looking more sepia toned, like on they're on old paper or old photos with that sort of yellow tint. But if I take them near a window in daylight, they have a much more white, new tint. And given the fact that the book is written from the 1940s or possibly the early 50s, it may seem like a better stylistic choice to make them look yellowish and old, even though the white looks cleaner. Yeah, and the topic of whiteness and racism plays into it. Yeah, um, always popping into my head, and also Asiatic blood is sometimes derisively referred to as yellow. So there's that layer to it. Anyway, any comments on that? Let me know. Here we go. Chapter 18, Ohoto. During our days at Ankuni Lake, and while we were traveling north and west on the Kuwi, Ohoto had been an incomplete man. He had been under the shadow of a great apprehension, greater than the depression we two white men felt at the sight of the empty tent circles and the scattered rock graves. That we had seen no deer and found only their tracks meant more to Ohoto than a temporary absence of the beasts from this land. He felt that he had been transported into a sort of Ihamwit hell, a hell of the worst possible kind, where there were no deer and never would be any deer. Mm. The hell and the heaven of the Ihamwit are real places that coexist in this world. Thus, heaven might be likened to the land where the deer of may always be found whenever a man has need of them. An actual glimpse of this paradise is vouchsafed to the people in the days when the great herds pass through their country. So hell is the place that knows nothing of the deer, and it too is present in reality during those times when there are no deer on the plains. Yeah, I think that deep-seated spirituality and cultural training probably has a lot to do with the fact that they're unwilling or unable to let go of their lives in the way that Franz thought that they would if they were rational, just abandoning it and go and live with civilization. Um, because anybody brought up with the people would, not even counting how awful it can be to live in the outskirts of civilization to native peoples who grew up with real community, but add to that the hell of having no caribou, no deer. Inevitably, Ohoto confused the nebulous concept of the Hamwood Hell with the unreality of the Ankuni country. The impact of this lifeless land was therefore much greater on him than it was on us, and we felt it strongly enough. We shared his sensation of existing as disembodied nonentities. We felt at times as if all reality were escaping from us. We two white men were irritatingly aware of moving through an imponderable void which became more and more oppressive. All this, I think, helps to explain two shocking things which happened to Ohoto during our voyage of exploration into the north and the west. During our trip up the Kui, Ohoto developed an abscess on his cheek. With each passing day, it grew deeper and angrier, but he was so engrossed in the gloom of his own thoughts that he seldom complained about it. I dressed it a few times, and after the fourth day, it had become so ugly that we took a chance and lanced it, but still it persisted. At first, I thought the presence of the sore was probably due to a nutritional upset, since Ohoto had never before gone without meat or existed on the devitalized foods of white men for so long a time. By the time we reached the headwaters of the Kui, the abscess had grown so deep and so large that Andy and I became seriously disturbed about it, and even the stoical Eskimo began to show signs of physical reaction to it. His appetite began to fail, and this is the most serious symptom an Inuit can betray, for food means more to him than anything else, almost. We made a good camp not far from the place where Kui left the unknown lake, and here we decided to stay until the sore began to show some signs of healing. Ohoto accepted our gesture with evident disinterest. He set up his little travel shelter, crawled into it, and showed no further signs of life until darkness had come. We were all tired with the long fatigue which comes from hard travel on empty stomachs, and I fell asleep as soon as I had crawled under my fly net. About midnight, I was awakened by blood chilling screams. There were inhuman sounds, far beyond the power of mere pain to induce, so they carried an overtone of such abject terror that I broke into a sweat without any knowledge of what had induced those fearful cries. I lay there a moment, but the shrieks were so penetrating they could not be ignored. Andy was sitting up in his bedroll, and he called out to me, "Good God, what the hell is that?" "Ohoto, I think," I replied. Then, without bothering to put on my clothes, I crawled stark naked from under my net, grabbed a rifle, and ran out over the broken rocks toward the tiny shelter where Ohoto lay. The screams ceased before I got there. Instead, my ears were assailed by a gurgling whimper, as if the man's voice had been overcome by sheer terror, leaving him with only an animal echo of sounds. I flung open the door flap of his tent with such vehemence that I ripped it and part of the wall clean off the poles. Ohoto was crouched inside, his body nearly filling the tiny space of the shelter, and he was staring at one of the slim poles with eyes as empty of all expression as those of a dead ox. His lips hung slack, and his great white teeth shone eerily in the light of the stars. I shouted his name, but the cringing thing on the rug paid no heed to me. Whimpers of fear still bubbled out of his throat. I became conscious of a feeling of panic, for I could see no sign of a danger capable of instilling such a fear in a man. For a moment, I thought Hoto had gone mad and was perhaps in the grip of a dread Arctic hysteria which makes insane murderers out of the sane men. The potentialities of being stranded in this empty wilderness with a mad Eskimo came unpleasantly to my mind. I acted by instinct. Dropping the rifle, I grabbed Ohoto by the hair and shook him so violently that he fell over and crashed into the frail wall of his tent. Then, to my relief, he made a tremendous effort, straightened up so that he was resting on his knees, and pointed a shaking hand at the blank stretch of canvas behind one of the poles of his shelter. The gesture was a mute appeal to me, and his eyes were fixed on my face, but where he pointed, I could see nothing at all except the discolored canvas and the smooth, peeled surface of the sapling pole. I still had no idea what was causing his terror. Finally, and with no coherent reason, I picked up the rifle and swung the butt as hard as I could against the slender tent pole. It was, for me, only a release of tension, but by the luck of fools and of white men, I was unwittingly doing what had to be done, the right thing. Ahoto relaxed with the abruptness of a deflating balloon. His eyes closed, and his erratic breathing sank to a long, deep rustle. He curled up like a dog, and in a moment the anticlimax of the night's work was on me. Ahoto began to snore loudly. He snored and snored. I became aware of the multitudes of mosquitoes clinging to my naked flesh and went hurriedly back to my bed and gave a garbled account of what I had seen to my anxious companion. Then for hours I lay and could not sleep, while the echo of Ahoto's snores sounded like a mocking denial of what had happened. But it had happened, and it was no nightmare of the sleep-drudged mind, but a nightmare in reality. When dawn came, we got dressed and went to see Ahoto. He was sleeping gently, and I nudged him with my foot until he woke, dazed by the depths of his slumber. This was itself odd, for during the previous week he had not slept except in brief naps, for the pain on his face had banished sleep. He lay still for a moment, then his eyes widened again and stared as they had stared at me during the night. His mouth drew back in a grimace, and I thought, "Oh Lord, here we go again." But he only rolled over so that he could see the tent pole against which I had driven my rifle. But then he spoke. "The Ino!" he cried. "Now it is gone!" He got up then, scrambled out of the wreck of his tent, and as he turned sideways to us, we both saw with a distinct shock that his abscess was almost healed. What had been a draining wound the night before was now dry and scabbed with a healthy look of growing skin. Ohoto carefully touched the hole in his cheek, and for a first time in many days he smiled. "Look," he said, turning to us, "now that the Ino is gone, the pain has left this thing in my face. Soon it will heal, and I will forget it, as I have already forgotten the pain." It seemed to be a time for explanations. I added my questions, and Ohoto readily answered them, for it appeared that he owed me a debt of gratitude. I listened to what he told us, and I was of two minds about it. Under the bright morning sun, it sounded like so much supernatural gibberish, yet I could not deny the evidence of my eyes as they dwelt on that inexplicably dried up sore. I listened and could not tell what was real and what was sheer fantasy. The abscess had been the work of a devil. That was the first thing. This visit of a malignant Ino, and Ohoto was specific about him, telling us that it was the spirit of a man who had not been buried and whose body had been eaten by wolves, had brought on the running sore as the first step in the destruction of Ohoto. But the devil chose to dally, and it was not until the night before that it decided to finish the job. It came with darkness. When Ohoto looked up from his pain-ridden sleep, he saw it clinging to the pole of the tent, grinning evilly down upon him. Ohoto thanked me profusely for my intervention. According to him, it was my haphazard swing of the rifle, coupled with some blasphemy I had not realized I was uttering, that convinced the Ino I was more than a match for it. It fled. The pain in Ohoto's face vanished on the instant, and by morning the abscess was well on its way to being cured. I must admit, quite frankly, I don't believe what Ohoto believed, and yet I know that in 3 days the abscess vanished, and that is the incredibly short length of time for natural healing to do its work. Curious what a modern medical doctor, or even a medical doctor from the 1940s and 50s, would have to say about that. And it was a doctor that had any respectful comprehension of the power of mind to heal. It's a real tangent, but I remember reading a story once about some incurable skin condition that covered the entire body with something like warts, and it was I think it's maybe in a psychology book or psychology text, and it was a young man who was a doctor and who had been exposed, I think, to the beliefs in the power of the mind in native or tribal cultures, or some spiritual um, school, and in his energy and his what he later thought was naivete, he tried to treat somebody who had this condition, which doctors believe was completely uncurable. And because he was just experimenting with it, he touched the man, or muttered some cure, or um, something, and told the man that half of his body would be cured of this ailment that normally covers the entire body. And lo and behold, the half of his body exactly in a straight line was cured of these warts, or whatever they were. And after that, this young doctor, who believed it truly, went to regular, older doctors, and he was told that what he had done was impossible. And he later tried to heal the rest of the man and to heal others with this condition, but he was never able to recreate it. And he eventually came to the belief that the reason he was able to do it cure the person, and he wasn't the person being cured like Ohoto here, but he was the one doing the curing, like perhaps like a genuine native shaman. Is that he believed it would work, and after he was told by respected doctors that it was impossible, he lost that deep belief and was never able to reclaim it, and so never able to replicate the cure. And maybe on some level, the patient could sense that his doctor, his shaman, didn't believe it, and that affected the placebo effect. Anyway, back to the book here. Less than a week after the Inno trouble, Ahoto's prophecy about his father's return, made when we first saw Ankuni Lake, came true. Eliatutna returned to the vision and hearing of Ahoto and spoke to his son. For a few days after his abscess cleared up, Ahoto's natural cheerfulness revived, but it was short-lived. When day after day we still failed to meet the deer, his mood grew dark again. Slowly we coasted along the northern shore of the unknown lake, staying timidly under the lee of towering rock dikes which the ice had gouged up and flung along the shores, for we had not forgotten the mysterious and malignant wind that had almost destroyed us early in the trip. Their surrounding country was so low-lying and shielded by continuous dikes that we could not see it from the lake. Low islands swung over the horizon and tantalized us with the belief that they were mainland before they blended with and disappeared into the rock wall which hemmed us in. The canoe was like a minute protozoan wandering in a vast saucer, aimlessly active and blind. Our horizon was either water or the rocky rim of the saucer. We crawled blindly along under the dubious shelter of the dikes and prayed we could not be forced to land except at places of our own choosing. For any attempt at beaching the canoe along the most of the formidable coast, except in a dead calm, would have resulted in the canoes being smashed to bits. During 3 days' travel, we found only 5 places where we could safely get ashore. From these places, we could look inland, and our eyes recoiled from what we saw. Beyond the dikes lay an endless cone of gray distance, a drowned and sodden land. It was a desperate sight, and its most frightening aspect was the almost complete absence of deer trails. It was completely free of the intricate network of such trails which mark almost all of the barren lands, for only a faint depression here and there might have been made by the feet of Tuktu a long time ago. After a few days of this, Ohoto was sunk into a depression that nothing could relieve. We had not only passed out of the realms of living men, but so far as we could see, he could see, we had passed completely out of the world as he knew it. This he was certain of, for there were no deer here, and never had been any deer. One night we found a rare shingle beach, a few yards long, crowded into a gap in the rock barriers along the shore. Gratefully we beached the canoe and made camp without a fire, for there was no wood. Ahoto was silent during our meal, and we too were under such tension that we made no effort to speak to him or to try to break the mood which had been obviously growing over him for days. When the meal was over, the Eskimo came to me and quietly asked me for my rifle. I knew there was no game about that he could hunt, and anyway, it was growing dark, for in late summer the nights are already long. I asked Ahoto why he wanted the gun, and he answered, saying, "Give me your gun, and in the morning think of the things that I have done for you. I know you will give my body what it demands, for you know the things which must be done. Nor will you leave me for the foxes and wolves, for you are a man of the Ihalmoit." And he exploded. "Suicide!" he shouted. "That's all we need to make this picnic really happy. That's all we need to make this picnic really happy." Certainly death filled Ahoto's thoughts, and as I realized the fact, the long tension of our journey seemed to reach an unbearable climax, and I gave way to livid anger. I told the Eskimo that he would have no gun, and I told him to wipe the idea from his mind or I would do it for him. He walked away from us and sat down on the rocks by the shore, while my companion and I rounded up the rifles, the hatchet, and all the knives, even Ahoto's, and hid the lot under the bedrolls in our tent. We were bitter against the man, for it was as if he had deliberately added this last unbearable weight to the. I said a memory. I'll get to it at the end of the paragraph. Weight to the heavy uncertainty which already clouded the outcome of our journey into nowhere. We were so burdened by the strain of this uncertainty that our nerves were worn to the thin, ragged edge, and our thoughts were no longer wholly rational. We told each other we did not give a damn what happened to Ohoto, that we were angry only because we did not relish having a dead man on our hands. After we had hidden the weapons, I went to Ohoto and I beat him with words as brutally as I could in the Inuit tongue. Ugh. He did not look up or answer me. After a while, I felt a sense of pettiness and self-disgust. I knew dimly that this man needed what sympathy and understanding we could give him, for if we were alone in the emptiness, then he was trebly alone. I caught my rage and squeezed it back into my heart and spoke gently to Ohoto, trying to make amends and to persuade him he must not die. If he heard me, he gave no sign, and now my rage flared up anew. I stalked back to the tent, cursing him in English as I went. The reason this is affecting me is it's reminding me of one of the hardest times in my life. Back in almost exactly 5 years ago, I guess it would have been, in the wake of the breakup with Jan in New Hampshire that so traumatized me. I had to move out of our apartment, and I was, for irrational reasons, set with the most powerful feelings of love after the breakup, not before. We were just living together as tolerant friends. But after she decided to break up with me, surprising me, I felt the strongest love I've ever felt in my life, and having no opportunity to fix it, partly because I ended up being unappealingly desperate. I sank into a great depression, and she still sometimes wanted me to visit as friends, but it was hard for her because my feelings weren't doing what she wanted. And one time during work, I got as close to the point of suicide as I'd ever felt in my life, and I went to this store after work, after leaving work at Pizza Hut, saying goodbye to people at work as in a way that was almost like saying goodbye to them forever. Not that they really noticed, but it was significant for me. And I went to the store and I bought a 24 pack of beer and a bottle of sleeping which pills, which I later learned, um, modern sleeping pills, which you can't die from. If you take a whole bottle of them, you'll just sleep forever. I mean, a long time. Anyway, I tried to decide, and I was torn whether I wanted to go to the apartment where the only sort of friends I had in town were Jen and some other people in the apartments, and or whether I wanted to go home and drink, have the bottle of sleeping pills and drink all the beer. And I decided to go to the apartment, and it happened to be like a Friday night, and Jen, unbeknownst to me, had an argument with a neighbor who she probably slept with at some point. She wasn't doing well, and she was drunk, and she'd had some kind of religious argument with him. He was religious, Christian, and she hated religion from her upbringing. And she saw me there, and I was sitting around the fire with some of the people. And at first, I was able to confide that I was feeling suicidal. And the first couple people there, who I didn't really know well, were empathetic and a little bit shocked, but forced themselves to think how they could help. And then our neighbor friend showed up first. Jen stayed behind on the rock that I'd driven by, where they were talking, and he was not so empathetic, and he knew that Jen was in a bad mood and suggested I go home, uh, even though I'd mentioned suicide. And then Jen showed up, and she was really angry I was there, even though previously she'd said I was welcome to come anytime as a friend. And and Chris, the neighbor, didn't want me to tell her what was going on, even though she insisted, asking why I was there. And I told her, and she went effing nuclear on me. Even though a couple years before she was traumatized by she had the fact that she'd had a suicidal friend and she wasn't able to help because her grandmother had died. It was the beginning of a 5 deaths in the families of the two of us in the scope of about 2 or 3 months. Her friend down in North Carolina, and then her grandmother in Minnesota. Actually, her grandmother first, and that was why she couldn't help the friend. She was in Minnesota, and then my grandmother and step grandfather on my father's side, bookending my father's death. This was 2016. So I'd expect, and she was traumatized by not being able to help her friend who was suicidal, and so I expected complete empathy from her, but she went nuclear on me. And she took me into my car and screamed at me with vomit on her breath in one of the most awful ways I've ever been screamed at in my life. And she eventually left my car, and I was trying to convince myself to drive away. And before I could convince myself to do that, she got back in my car, wondering why I hadn't left, and then screamed at me in nuclear rage again for another, I don't know how long it was, 15 minutes, whatever. And I was so shocked by it all that it actually, in the end, kind of shook me out of it. It was just so beyond the pale that it separated me from those suicidal feelings. And I went home just completely baffled. And the bafflement just overtook the suicidal depression. And she eventually called, and she had gotten to the point that Mowat here seems to have gotten at, feeling shame for not being empathetic. She was, I don't know, sobering up, and she said it was inexcusable. And in the years since then, I've wished I didn't answer her call, and I just said that I just texted back, "Fuck off, monster," or something. In so many ways, I wished I'd fought more for my own self-respect than being such a doormat during all that period. It's part of the reason I got so depressed. Yeah. I know we can't even be friends right now because I was such a doormat. She's friends with people her exes that she cared about a lot less. Um, anyway, that's a real confessional, but highly relevant to the two-way psychology of suicide, I guess, and depression. I'll reread the last paragraph. It's been so long, the short one. If he heard me, he gave no sign, and now my rage flared up anew. I stalked back to the tent, cursing him in English as I went. Andy and I went to bed, both of us filled with a tight anger against the Eskimo. I tried to put him out of my thoughts, but neither sleep nor forgetfulness was possible. We had not been in the tent many minutes when a pair of yellow-billed loons pierced the heavy silence with their frenetic cries. They were the first living things we had heard for days, but instead of relieving the tautness in us, they only intensified it, for their lunatic babble was not what one expects from creatures of flesh and blood. Hardly had they begun their wailing refrain when Ohoto's voice joined them. The sounds of the loons became a maniac chorus of Ohoto's voice as he intoned the high-pitched and monotonous chant which is peculiar to the Hammoud who know they are about to die. The song went on endlessly into the night until I clutched the sleeping bag so tightly that my nails cracked against the rough canvas. Exhaustion eventually overcame me, and I slept to grapple with hideous nightmares until just before dawn I awoke. I lay there for a long time, staring up into the white mist of my net before I realized that the singing had stopped. Then I felt a sick nausea rocked me, and I lay there believing that Ohoto was gone. When it was full dawn, I went over to Ohoto's shelter. He was not there. I began searching, and as I failed to find him, I grew frantic and ran, stumbling among the boulders of the dike. At last I found him, lying face downward in the thick moss near the beach. For a long time, I stood over his still form, hesitating to touch the ragged fur of his old parka. But as I looked down upon him, the light grew stronger, and I saw that his parka was lifting and falling in the shallow, regular rhythm of sleep. The relief that I felt was utterly magnificent. I shouted at him, and when he sat up and began rubbing his eyes, I tossed him my tobacco pouch and my own pipe. If he had been standing, I would have thrown my arms around his neck. It was a penitent but subdued Eskimo who had his breakfast with us that morning. We, on the contrary, were so relieved to have him still with us that we were cheerful and even voluble. However, unlike the time he had been troubled by the Ohoto was not at all anxious to explain what had underlain his suicidal mood of the previous night. But we had forgiven him, and so we felt it was our right to know the story. Interesting right to draw from forgiveness. Several days elapsed before we heard it all. I repeat it now. The continuity is mine, but the content is Ohoto's. When I was a Nutarik, in brackets, but a child, my father often traveled on the River of Men. My father, Iliatutna, used to venture far down the river, even as far as the lake called Hikoliguak, for he knew the land well, having lived at the Ankuni camp in the days before disaster came to that place. My father was a shaman, though only a little one. Still, he had less fear of the spirits than most men have, and that was why he continued his journeys on the river for many years after men had deserted its banks. My father, almost alone of the hamlet, visited Ankuni after the great dying there. He had a love for the land about the great lake, and that love was only tempered by fear of the empty tent rings and the full graves. Many a time Eliatutna swore he would return to Ankuni, where he had seen his first deer as a child, and where his spirit, would remain for all time to come. When he died, in my tent at the Trader's Lake, far to the east of here, I placed all things needful for a journey on his grave, for I knew he would take those things and go from the foreign place where he died and return again to the camps which lie under Kinatua. It was because I knew this that I spoke of Eliatuna when we first climbed Kinatua and looked out over the dead land about the great lake. I knew that hill, I knew that place, and I knew also that somewhere near the ghost of Eliatutna lingered. That knowledge gave me a happiness which was not unmixed with fear, for though I loved Eliatutna, I do not love ghosts. We had been camped on the shores of Kinatua Bay only a few days when I knew that Eliatutna had discovered me. I could neither see nor hear him then, but I knew he was there, and his presence brought me both fear and comfort as I walked over the land of the dead. When we left Ankuni and traveled up Kui, Eliatutna was near, and as we went from the great place of graves, it seemed that the spirit of my father grew in strength until at times I believed I heard the distant sound of his remembered voice. Thus it was that when we stood on the shores of this nameless lake at last, it was Eliatutna who whispered the words I said to you, saying that we should turn back from the emptiness which stretched ahead. You would not turn back, and so we went on into the strange land of water, and it happened that Eliatutna lost his powers, for this was a land where he did not belong. He could do nothing for me when the devil who haunted this river came into my face and would have destroyed me but for your magic. Still, you would not turn back, though now the voice of Iliatutna was strong, and so I knew that I was passing into his world, the world of spirits. All day I heard his voice, and for long hours my father spoke to me, telling me the tales of his youth and of the youth of this land. Eliatutna spoke of the time when the tents of the people were as many as clouds on a day when the white spirits roll over the sky. My father told me of the time when the deer were so many that the hamlet had no use for the word hunger. He spoke also of the days when the great fleets of kayaks made the long journey north to the meeting place called Akilignia, Akilignea, Akil in Gnea, the high ridge where the Inuit of the coast came to the edge of our land to gather wood and to trade with us. The memory of my father stretched farther back in time, and he spoke of the days when all the people who became the Hamwood lived 50 days' march to the west, by the shores of a truly mighty lake, such as we have never seen. Eliatutna told me how the Itkillit came on that lake from the south and west and attacked the Inuit there, and the survivors fled into the east, and over the lifetimes of many men, they journeyed slowly eastward to escape the Itkillit raids until at last they found this land of the Helmut. But most of all, Eliatutna spoke of the deer. He spoke of the days when the deer needed a full month to pass by the famous crossing places, and as my father talked, I looked out from your canoe and saw no living thing in all the land, and my heart grew weak, and I grew dazed, and could not tell if I had died and was already in the place where no deer are, and where the hungry spirits whine over the plains, seeking the deer that are not there. I heard Eliatutna's voice grow steadily in strength, but it was not until we reached this camp that I saw my father once more. He stood by me near the shore. You who are Cablonais could not see him, though he saw you as you walked to and fro. It was then, and in this place, that Eliatutna spoke the words which made me want your rifle, that I might seek out my rest. My father spoke no more of the old times, but spoke instead of the people and of the land that it is now. He talked of hunger and of the great pain. He spoke of the lesser killers and of the blood spitting which comes upon the women and children. He bade me look at you, and he said, See, Ohoto, these are the Cablunais who were also the sons of the first women, even as we also came from her womb. Yet she sent them from her, and from this land, which was theirs as well as ours. She wronged them in that ancient time, but they did not forget, nor did they forget that we were the favored ones of our common mother. They returned again. They returned for their revenge, and in their train they brought the great pain and the blood spitting. They took the deer and hid them from us, so that we knew the meaning of famine. They are clever, and they have come to claim the land which was once ours. And you, my son, now you are here with me in the land of the dead, and that is well. In the tents you left behind upon the shores of the little lakes there is only evil, and perhaps there will be no people left to greet you when you return. Even should those faces that you know still smile to see you come, yet remember that their time is short, and I speak the truth. The days will come when there are no more faces left to greet you, when you come in from your fruitless hunts. I am Agniokok, a shaman, Ohoto, and a ghost who can see all that your eyes cannot see. What were the people in my youth but a great people who filled all the wide plans with the voices of men, wide plains with the voices of men? Not that men don't have plans. You know what the people are now, but what will they be at the end of the winter which stretches ahead? A few new graves by the rivers that flow through the land. And Ahoto, my son, where will he be in those times? When the Cablunais remain, he too may remain, but when they are done with his help, where will he go? A time will come when he will die, and there will be no man of his people left to bury his bones. The wolves will have what is left of my son, and his spirit will find no peace in all of the world. I guess that helps understand Ahoto's point of view a little bit. If he dies and is buried appropriately, then he will have an afterlife that is appropriate. And of course, he believes the Cablunais, the Andy and Mowat, will be able to take care of themselves, and it is not their land, and they will get home and they will live. Yeah. This is also making me think of one of what feels to me like one of the only other, in adulthood anyways, spiritual spirit related experiences that I may or may not have had at a time when I was one of the first times I really used mushrooms in a spiritual way. I was lying next to the narcissistic woman, Alyssa, that I somehow developed a empathy and connection for back in 2020, maybe May, 2 years ago now. Anyway, we'd both done some mushrooms. She'd brought them, and we were sleeping on my bed. It didn't mean any sex or anything, but she'd sort of fallen asleep on the mushrooms, and I was having a very sort of profound experience next to her, and I had this strange vision. I've often described it. It was like I was being exposed to some greater force in the universe, sort of sparkling lights and almost like insects in a way, and um, and to some great dark force behind everything. And I saw Alyssa's face, and but it was kind of like a stone mask, and behind it was this dark force. I suppose you could say it was some kind of narcissism, which I didn't knew she had. And it swung back. Her face swung back like a door, and I saw this darker power. And this sort of force of the universe was, in some ways, sort of sparkling lights around me, protecting me and informing me. But it also became like the dark, shadowy, infinite fingers of this dark force, and they started to descend from above around me like slow drawing bars of a cage, and they were coming down so slow that I could tell they were the bars of a potential prison. And I was in a way being asked very consciously by some higher power whether I wanted to be put in this prison. And the prison I look at it as like intentionally venturing into the belly of this dark beast that sort of had control of Alyssa, and where some foolishly noble part of me felt like I might better be able to attack it from within and help her, as long as she didn't abandon me to it, even though I knew on some level that this dark force would realize I was defenseless and would devour and digest me if she left me alone in it. If her door swung away and she disappeared, which she eventually did. And so when months later in the fall, that COVID winter and the presidential election, when I realized I expressed too much of my emotion and she did in fact vanish, in some ways that sort of prophecy began to come true. And it's one of the reasons I sort of fell apart that winter and ended up in the hospital and had to leave Sirius, because in some real ways I felt like I was being devoured by a darkness. And of course, I've got no genuine connection with any kinds of gods of that place that a native community would have genuinely found. There's some talk that the leaders of Sirius had some connection with spirits of that place, but I never really got close enough to them to know. But it does make me think about genuine earthbound spirituality and dark spirits and possession, and the Inno that possessed and would have killed Ohoto, even though an Inno was a very minor evil spirit. And never mind some great dark force. There are times in my life where I felt like there's tremendous power and strength in me. And there are times when I've had the sense of getting a vague sense of it and almost being able to tap it and becoming some tremendously strong and powerful and clear-headed, strong of character adult human. And it's not currently where I feel. Sometimes I feel like it's, as with the movie Rocky, that I sometimes wonder if that great strength is just now too far away, that I'm too old. Rocky was in his late 20s when he found that strength to get beyond his line, "It's a living," and was blessed in a Deus Ex Machina kind of way with the title fight. Sometimes I feel like I would need to an external Deus Ex Machina like that, being drawn into I don't know, some kind of great quest. People who were greatly embroiled in political rebellion and the support of democracy, and that trapped as Rocky was without that blessing of his name, causing Apollo Creed to pick him out of a hat and give him the title fight without having to do all the work to get there, that I might just fade away into obscurity like Rocky would have if he hadn't had that Italian stallion name that made him stand out in a patriotic way. Anyway, that was a long tangent. Try to stop before I get too obscure, confusing, or ramble too much. So spoke Eliatutna, my father, and I knew the truth of his words, and I wished to borrow your gun and make an end to the waiting. But the guns were hidden, and when I came to look for my knife, it too was gone. So I went and sat by the shore in the darkness and sang the songs of the dying, believing the power of Eliatutna, my father, would bring me to death. Yet before morning he left me, and when I searched for him by the rocks, he was gone, and I was alive. Then I had no heart left in me, and I felt in the moss, and I wept, knowing that I was alone. There have been times where I've wished for the death to take me without, Ohoto would have done it if he'd had the tools, but I have access to the tools sometimes. I mean, I could get a gun, I could get the knives, but I wouldn't do it if I tried. But there are times where I've sort of wished, gone to sleep and wished to not wake up again, or in the morning and wishing to go to sleep and never waking up again, or that uh, sometimes I've fantasized about manufacturing a noble death. I've sometimes thought of the 5 tiered ways of committing suicide. One of them sort of dying with nobility, like throwing yourself in front of a car to push some child out of the way, or maybe the second tier would be manufacturing some artificial thing like that with an actor where you seem to be doing it nobly. One of them would be warning people in advance that you're going to do it, and one of them would be and asking them for help, um, or either help saving yourself or help doing it. One of them would be leaving a suicide note, and one of them would just be nothing, just disappearing or leaving no note. That would be the worst possible way. I don't ever believe I'll do it, but trying to get into the empathy and the psychology of truly feeling lost and the darkness behind that stone face, stone woman, not a stone man like an Inukak, but darkness and depression and suicidal thoughts. The death of a culture on Ohoto's scale is far worse than the more vague sense of the death of civilized culture in the face of political collapse and environmental collapse. But there is definitely connection and empathy. Anyway, that's the end of the chapter. Thanks for listening and watching.